Hey everybody, I'm Jay Scherr with Jay Scherr Business Consulting. We help entrepreneurs, business owners, and other leaders maximize their potential, build rock-solid foundations for their businesses, and create more freedom in their lives. And you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. Viktor Frankl said, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." Well, on today's episode, we're going to talk about the changes we need to make to be remarkable or become irrelevant, the emerging problems organizations and leaders face today, the leadership mind leaps, how we can take the big leap, and more. My guest is a father of two, a best-selling author, a strategy and transformation consultant, a sought-after keynote speaker, board advisor, and an award-winning podcast host. He holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and a BA in economics from Tufts University. He's widely considered one of the most foremost and influential voices in the retail industry and has worked with dozens of brands to catalyze and design their journey to remarkable results. His thoughts on the future of shopping are regularly shared in his role as a Forbes Senior Contributor, as well as through other media outlets including CNN, The Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg. Please welcome the president of Sageberry Consulting and the man who's teaching all of us to aim higher, move faster, and make the bold leap to remarkable, Steve Dennis. Steve, it is so great to see you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks. Well, I appreciate I appreciate that very warm and generous introduction, and I'm excited to be here on the show with you.
As am I, and thank you. I appreciate it. And, I've learned so much through researching you and doing my due diligence, and of course, reading your latest book, Leaders Leap. What a remarkable story that you've had and a journey that you've been on through your career. And I thought, Steve, a good starting point for us to give us some context around who you are would be maybe for you to share what your favorite thing is about yourself and why.
Well, what I would say during the past probably 15 years or so, which may tie to some of the things we get into in the book, is my openness to change. I wouldn't have said that about myself for probably my first 40 years or so on this earth. But there was a point where I really kind of rewired my attitude to be more open, to be more compassionate, to let my ego down more and more. I still struggle with that, just to be clear. But I think that other than, saying my favorite thing is I think I'm a pretty good father, but I think in the context of this conversation, that would be probably what I'd go to.
So I love that openness to change, and you heard the quote that I offered at the beginning of the show. Is that a quote that you're familiar with?
Well, I love that quotation, but I was also smiling because it was one of the quotes that was originally in the book, and for various reasons, it got edited out. Yeah, I have a little, it's not so easy for me to reach, but here on my desk, I use all these note cards. As much as I'm very digitally savvy, I have some analog things that I do, which include capturing quotes. So I'm sure somewhere in my pile is the original Viktor Frankl, or the original note that I took on that quotation, because I do love it.
Well, that's so interesting that was originally to be in your latest book. And, I refer to that quote from time to time because, like you, I was not very open to change. And there have been a number of situations throughout my life where I let my ego get in the way. And as opposed to looking at myself, right, turning that mirror and really doing the deep work, I was constantly trying to either blame others or look for excuses. And that quote just really landed with me. And as I was thinking about your story and what you write about in the book, that quote just it landed for me, and I
Yeah.
felt that it was appropriate here, and I'm glad that you brought up that openness to change. So, why don't you give us an example, something relevant throughout your life, and maybe we go back a bit in time, and let's talk about when maybe you weren't so open to change and what life was like at that juncture, and then we can pull the timeline a bit forward as you begin to become more open. And why was that so important? Why did that become something that you felt you needed to do?
Well, I appreciate the question. I guess I would say there's a couple dimensions to it. I think, mostly for better. I went to Harvard Business School, was one of the youngest people in my class, started a business when I was in college, went to work for a prestigious strategy consulting firm. And pretty early on, I started to really define myself largely by my career success. And as time went on, I think I got more and more, and I was pretty. I think most people looking from afar would say I was pretty successful. I was the youngest corporate vice president in Sears Roebuck and Company's history. I was on the senior leadership team at the Neiman Marcus Group at a relatively young age, and so there was a lot of things that were, at least from the outside, looking pretty great. As I talk a little bit about in my book, it's not a memoir, just to be clear, but in case people are wondering, but I talk about some of my struggles with depression and anxiety, but kind of the way I medicated myself, or one of the ways I medicated myself, was through workaholism and just being overly attached to my personal success, which was to the detriment of my health. It was to the detriment of being a good husband, being a good father, etc. And so I think for various reasons, and I'm not a psychologist either, so I don't want to try to be like a closet psychologist here, but I think my ego is really ruling the roost. I got very focused on my success in my career. And by the time I got to Neiman Marcus, I believed that there were a couple of really important things, but they aren't so important to the story. People can ask me offline if they want to, I guess, if they want more details. But there were two things as the head of strategy there and customer insight that I felt very strongly about and tried very hard to persuade my boss, the board, the senior leadership team to come over to my point of view. And I wrote a blog post a number of years ago called "The Problem with Being Right." It was a number of years ago now at this point. But what happened for me is that I could not separate what was going on for me at work from who I was. And to the degree that I could not persuade people to agree with me, the more and more agitated and miserable I became. I was not really open to a different way of doing things, nor was I really able to see, which is a little bit of an aside, but I'm sure many people can relate to this. What was going to persuade the management team was not how great my facts were, how compelling my logic was, or what a beautiful PowerPoint presentation I put together. There were other reasons why they weren't going to change that had nothing to do with me, but I very much made it about me. And that ended up becoming a really difficult time for me, ultimately caused me to leave the company. And ultimately the good part was it set me upon a different path. But I think it's an example where my ego was really driving the bus. I couldn't see straight, and I had a hard time separating myself and my whole life from my success at the particular thing that I was doing in my career. So it was a very painful time for me and my family and others. But ultimately, it was kind of a big revelation.
Let me ask you a question, if I could,
Sure.
before we move forward. At this particular point, as painful as that experience was for you, did you have the self-awareness to recognize what was going on, or was someone else or were others pointing things out to you that you blind spots, if you will, that you weren't recognizing? So help us clear that piece up, if you
Sure.
will.
I'm not proud of this, but I would say on a scale of 0 to 10, my self-awareness was maybe at a 1.
Mm.
I was so habituated to seeing the world in this way and having the ego in charge. I mean, I was aware that my relationships weren't good, my health wasn't good, that things were difficult for me at work. It wasn't like I didn't understand that, but I would say my attitude was really more directed towards, people that know a lot about psychology would probably recognize as victim anger, that I was being persecuted. And these idiots, if they would only, don't they understand how brilliant I am, how I'm trying to help them, I had all this sort of self-righteousness about it. And I was right. I'm right, like, why can't you see it? And so it was very much focused outward. And I would say, to the extent things were focused inward, it wasn't from a mindfulness or awareness perspective or being introspective. It was more like, what's wrong with me? Why can
Mm.
I not? It became really a wound to myself rather than something that made me think, oh, maybe if this isn't working, which, of course, ultimately ties to some of the things I talk about in the book. But also, I think what many of us have probably experienced is, if, what is it, now I'm forgetting now whether it's Churchill or whatever, but, or Santayana or somebody, you keep, completing the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I mean, that was me. Like, I kept doing it, and I just thought, and I make this, it's not a very funny joke, but I make this joke about, believing that I was always one more iteration of a PowerPoint presentation away from convincing anybody of anything. Like, I was so caught up in my intellect and my skills, and so therefore I was just going to keep, doing this jujitsu kind of thing, trying to find that vulnerability. And, as it turned out, that mostly annoyed the people I was doing it to, and it made me crazy. So,
Well, I
so yeah, it
appreciate
was,
I appreciate you sharing this and being vulnerable because, look, there are many, I'm sure, that are listening right now, including me, that can relate to what was happening, the way that you felt, the ego taking over, thinking that your idea is the right idea, that what you're doing is the right thing. And maybe it was, but not being able to get your team either behind it or maybe not recognizing some of the things that were going on. And it's a
mhm,
very difficult place to operate from. And clearly,
absolutely.
it for many of us, it can lead to burnout. It can lead to anxiety, a number of things that you have brought up. So
Yeah,
thank you for sharing that. So then let's
sure.
talk about how you how did you heal that wound
Yeah.
that you were feeling?
Well, eventually, like, I realized that I needed some professional help. And so that was, frankly, that was a big part of it, was willing to, um, and not, I will tell you, just to be perfectly honest about it, not always all that willingly. My now ex-wife was certainly somebody who was like, you need to get your act together. So there were people that were basically confronting me with my unhelpful behavior. But I also knew that I was struggling. So professional help was a big part of it. Um, One of the things, and I'm not an especially religious person or whatever, and I'm not trying to persuade anybody of any particular view, but I decided that, and I'll talk more about sort of in the context of spirituality, not necessarily ascribing to a particular form of religion or whatever, but I was like, I was sort of my own higher power for a long time. And I thought, well, maybe there's different different ways to be in the world. And so I just decided more or less that what I was doing wasn't working. So maybe there's something else. And so I went into an exploration of Buddhism and some other things, started meditation practice and things that were, have been helpful over the years. But I think a lot of it was this, and I talk about this in the context of leadership and in the context of business strategy. I mean, I think some of that is to approach things with a beginner's mind, that we don't have all the answers. And in fact, I think in a strategy context, as well as personal context, relationship context, this idea, particularly in a world that's changing really quickly, so this is much more in the strategy context, in a world that's changing very quickly, the idea that's what has made us successful in the past is going to serve us well in the future is very much not necessarily true. I mean, it's going to, your mileage may vary, but I think we see plenty of examples where, including some leaders that I've worked with directly or have consulted to, where they can't get out of their own way. They've been so successful for one set of strategies or coming at problems in a certain way, and it turns out they're not able to adapt very well. In fact, I think you can make an argument that not only some people are probably familiar with the book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, but not only is that true, but what I've seen in my own personal situation, but also as an advisor and coach to executives, is it may get in the way of making the changes. Like you have such a one, Liam Neeson, I have a very particular set of skills, right? If that's your view and everything, the old, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I mean, there's a lot of that I see with leaders in their personal style, but from a broader leadership perspective, it often keeps this focus on incrementality rather than, a complete change. So in my case, personally, it was like, okay, what I've been doing for all these years is demonstrably not working. So I should stop doing that. I didn't really have a clear idea on what the alternative was. So I decided to open the aperture and kind of start with a clean slate and say, I'm going to be open to more possibilities because some people seem to find these approaches to be helpful. And, eventually I kind of pieced together my own particular spiritual view and practices and things like that. So I'm not saying that the way I did it is the way to do it for everybody. I'm sure it's not. But what I would say is if you keep doing the same things, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's as a leader, whether it's as a board member, whatever it might be, and you're not getting good results, maybe stop, approach things like a beginner would, open the aperture, and try on some other things for size, because you may very well discover that there is, in fact, a better way, including maybe things that you never, like I couldn't have told you a damn thing about Buddhism. I can tell you when I knew who the Buddha was, but that was about it because I read Siddhartha in college. But, I didn't know anything particularly helpful. And, but I also went down other paths as well. And for various reasons, they weren't the ones that I thought worked for me. But, there's a lot of stuff out there, whether we're talking about marketing strategies, whether we're talking about how to do a startup or a much more complex organization.
Well, this is brilliant what you're sharing, and I just want you to know how much I appreciate you sharing from a personal perspective and what you went through. And it's interesting as I'm looking for some common threads here. I also went down the path of studying Buddhism and meditating, and I got pretty heavy into Stoic philosophy and a number of different things to really try to create some space so I could just not only work to ground myself, but also to be able to get greater perspective. And these different things have been certainly very helpful. But I think to your point, this is what maybe worked for you, but it's not the end all, and it's not something that may work for everyone. So I think it's important that for all of you that are watching or listening right now, that you realize and make sure that you're surrounding yourself with people who can give you good feedback, who can help shine a light when they're seeing some things happening that maybe you should be aware of, right? Helping you identify some of those blind spots. And then if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. Stop digging and try something different. And, as you were sharing part of your story, Steve, you brought it up, the book by Marshall Goldsmith, right? What got you there won't get you, or what's the actual title? What
got you here won't get you there.
Yeah, what got you here won't get you there.
Won't get you there.
Yeah, and it's such a valid point. And you've seen this, Steve, firsthand with companies that you have studied, companies that you've worked with, right, that get in their own way. And because they've had success in a certain area, they just kind of get locked into that mode. And they keep doing the same thing, hoping that the results are going to be different. And obviously you speak about that in Leaders Leap. Mm-hmm. So let's switch a bit then to the actual book itself. And Leaders Leap, it's all about transforming your company at the speed of disruption. And I would love it if we could first talk for just a moment or two about why you decided that now was the right time to write this book. My understanding in doing some research is that you actually finished this book at what, maybe the end of 2023. And it,
yeah, that's right.
It's first of all, it's it's an excellent book, and we're going to dig into certain aspects of this. Obviously, we don't have time to cover every area of it, but there are certain specifics that I would like to address with you. But this is it's a different book than your first book. We've talked a bit about your personal story. You share some of the personal context here. Why did you choose to write this book? It's a departure from what you've done in the past.
Yeah. Well, I guess I have a few different angles into that. Perhaps I should have a crisper answer, but I'll try to keep it concise. I mean, one is I've been working in growth, innovation, transformation, really my entire career to varying degrees. And for example, I started my retail career at Sears, which I'm sure most people will probably know at one time was the most valuable retailer on the planet. It now more or less doesn't exist anymore. So there's part of me, which is how could you, and whether we're talking about Sears or Blockbuster, or, you can go through a list of retail names, but also BlackBerry, Oldsmobile, these companies that were iconic, successful companies for a long time that are either gone completely or are mere shells of their former selves. So how does that happen? Now, I'm sure some people will know Clayton Christensen's work with the innovator's dilemma, points out that often the so-called incumbent or legacy brands have a hard time responding to changes and disruption because they're very protective of their core, all about sort of optimizing, managing better, and so they can kind of get blindsided easily. So there was part of me, because that book was written or came out in 1997, which was really pre-internet. There's part of me that says, okay, there's a lot of valid points. If anything, because the pace of change is accelerating, this problem is even bigger today than it was when Dr. Christensen wrote that. But also it wasn't for the digital age. So there was part of me that said, like, if I could write the innovator's dilemma for the modern era, that would be a pretty cool thing, or even come close to it. But I just continue to be amazed, and it's not an exact line that appears in the book, actually. But as I've been talking about the book and people have asked me about it, and I think about my own experience or companies that I study or write about or speak about or whatever, I keep coming back to kind of one unifying idea, which is if the world has changed so much, because I think everybody will agree, the world has changed tremendously. Like, that's not a controversial thing to say. But if the world has changed so much, why have you changed so little? Like, that to me just seems paradoxical or nonsensical in a way. And so some of the innovator's dilemma ideas are part of it. But what I thought I could bring to the equation, and these references may or may not be helpful to people, but it's like if Clayton Christensen and Brene Brown had a book baby, this would be the book, because I think there's a strategy point to this. And then there is the kind of courageous leadership, vulnerability kind of work that Brene does. And I think, Brene, and I love Brene Brown, by the way. She's one of my biggest inspirations for sure. I quote her a bunch in the book. Um, she's not a business strategy person, right? Uh, Clayton Christensen, the late great Clayton Christensen, very academic in his approach. Doesn't get too much into leadership principles in terms of pragmatic advice. So I kind of wanted deliberately to see if I could do this mashup between kind of personal transformation, courageous leadership, along with having been a corporate executive and seeing what happens in real life with organizations, not just retail organizations that struggle. So, but I also, last thing I promised before I give this long-winded answer, but I also wanted to challenge myself as much as I am proud of my first book, which has done well, reviewed well, etc. It's it's overly prescriptive in some respects. Like I was really trying to show off. Like I didn't think about this when I was writing it, but as I look
Okay.
back on it, it was like, well, I may never write another book. I'm going to take 300 pages or 280 or whatever it is, and here is my all you need to know about retail from Steve Dennis. And it's like I say, I'm proud of the book. It's useful. I've many people say very nice things about the book, so I'm not trying to undermine my own work or dissuade people from buying it. It still sells quite well 4 years later, but to me, it was just overly prescriptive and a little bit academic. And I wanted to challenge myself to write something, to the extent there's kind of prescriptive versus inspirational. I wanted to be much more on the inspirational side. I actually started down a path which would have been a much longer book. I was going to try to synthesize a lot of other great thinkers' pieces and be like my own interpretation of this. And I just thought, A, it doesn't really interest me. B, I don't know if people want to consume a book like that. Not for me anyway. I mean, if I were perhaps more famous as a psychologist or something, they would. But I thought, this is my own experience based on a ton of experience in doing this sort of work on the ground, as well as studying, analyzing from far. And if people can get a few big ideas out of it, that's great. They don't need a 17-point plan to go do it. I just think, one, it would be really hard to write that book, even if I were more skilled at it. Because I guess, sorry, I lied. I'll say one other thing. When I was working on this book and trying to figure out my approach to it, and I got The Innovator's Dilemma and Good to Great and Blue Ocean Strategy and a lot of these, really, really successful and I think for the most part excellent books. The main thing I noticed about them is they're sort of impenetrable. And by that I mean they're long, they're dense, there are 32 case study examples or whatever. And it's cool. Like if you want to know about Korean semiconductors, here's Jim Collins telling you about that. And then if you want to know about Starbucks, there's so many stories and everything. And I don't know. I just felt like what has benefited me is a few powerful, hopefully powerful, simple ideas that, like what I would imagine or what I would hope for, which I've heard already of a few companies doing this is the sort of book you buy for your whole management team. And you go, and you can go through and say, okay, are we thinking radically enough about this problem? Are we, letting our ways of doing things historically blind us to possibilities that are in front of us? Do we have to unlearn some things in order to move forward? What are we not letting go of? You can have those sort of conversations opposed to digesting. And so nothing against Jim Collins or Clayton Christensen. Those books are amazing. They've influenced me a lot. But I'm not capable of writing that kind of book, first of all. But second of all, I'm not sure that's what a lot of leaders really would benefit from. And I would like to see people actually take action on these ideas.
Well, what I love is that first you nailed it with this book, and I think that the books that you just
Thank
listed
you.
they are excellent books, right? There's no question about that. This is a book that it's first of all it's easily digestible. First and foremost, that was one of the first things that I noticed about it, and you give some great actionable tips, and it's written in such a way that it walks you through a process that you can start to take action on these things immediately. I think to your point, like you just made, where a leadership team can get together and they can talk through what's happening in their own business and use Leaders Leap as a guide to prompt them for certain questions, things that we should be thinking about, things that we should be digging more deeply on. And I really appreciate the way that you put the book together. And I wanted to mention to all of our, absolutely, I wanted to mention to all of those that are watching and listening right now, we're going to provide a link, obviously, to both of Steve's books. But Steve, I did want to mention, I didn't want to let this go. I didn't realize that you and Seth Godin had known each other for so long, that you went to Tufts together.
Yes.
But I love Seth's quote about your first book, stating, basically summarizing that it's the best retail book of all time. Amazing. So we're going to link to that. And for all of you that are in the retail space, do yourself a favor. Buy a copy of Remarkable Retail. Read that book. Digest it. Make sure that you are consuming it and putting the actions that you, or putting the lessons that you learn through that book into practice. Now, let's switch topics here to Leaders Leap. There are basically 3 parts to this book. And the first part is remarkable or irrelevant. And in this part of the book, you basically describe what the emerging problems are that organizations and their leaders face. Part 2 is the 7 leadership mind leaps. That's where you provide the solutions to the problems that you describe in part 1. And then
Ideally,
part 3, ideally. And then part 3 is the leader's leap, right? It is advice on how we incorporate those 7 mind leaps into our organizations and into our leadership teams. So what I would love to do is just briefly, let's start with some of the emerging problems as you see them based on your research, insights, the work that you're doing day in, day out. What are some of the problems that organizations and leaders should be paying attention to?
Well, to a certain degree, and one of the things I do in part 2 is end with some questions to try to take the more abstract points to try to help people put it in the context of their unique situation, because it's pretty hard to give advice that's going to work, big organizations, small, nonprofit, for-profit, et cetera. But I would say, there's really been, at the risk of stating the obvious, we've gone through several pretty profound waves of disruption that have affected, I would say, most businesses over the past 20 or 25 years. The most obvious one is probably internet and e-commerce, where, instead of just selling things kind of face to face in a physical environment, now you can get access to things, 24/7 from anywhere around the world. I think the second biggest big wave of disruption broadly is the almost ubiquity of smart devices, right? So now we have powerful computers in our hands. We're all connected to each other, social media, text, et cetera, which has created and really propelled a bunch of different business models. Then you kind of have the, I guess, more powerful computing, 5G, cloud computing, these kinds of things, which have also allowed for other business models to exist. So depending upon where you are, you may be, if you're just to pick a more mundane example, if you're a little florist in some small town, where your competition was the guy down the street, suddenly you're in competition with the universe, really, because your customer may be able to buy something online, have it shipped to their home or delivered by, an Uber driver or whatever, all these kinds of things. So I think the competitive landscape has changed radically. The nature of connection between companies and their customers has changed radically. One of the quotes I have in the book is from Scott Cook, the founder of Intuit, about where he says, and I'm paraphrasing it, and I have it in front of me, but a brand is no longer what we tell customers it is. It's what our customers tell each other it is. So you've gone from this kind of top-down push model of marketing and communication where the brand owners, whether we're talking B2B or B2C, tend to have a lot of the power, to one where consumers, customers are armed or have access to a tremendous amount of data. Like, how do I know which products are best? What other people say, not what does my sales rep say or what does the TV ad say? What price should I pay? Those kinds of things. Really, the power was very much, so that power has really flipped. So, I think this world that was based upon being kind of very constrained, where there was a lot of friction in buying and selling and marketing, is now, a lot of that friction is gone. A lot of information is now available, often in nanoseconds, as opposed to the customer having to invest a lot of time or sort of figuring out, is there anybody I go to church with that has a Maytag washer? Like, that's, people forget, sometimes when I'm talking to people that are under 40, and I would say, well, if you had to go buy a dishwasher, well, you drove to Sears and the local Maytag dealer, and maybe you got Consumer Reports, and maybe there was an article in the last couple of years. It's just like, sounds so old, and there are only 3 TV networks, and et cetera. And if you wanted to watch Seinfeld, it was on once at that time, and maybe a summer rerun in 6 months, right? Like, so much has changed. That's why I go back to the world has changed so much. Like, anytime you start to talk about things that were true in the 90s or even the early 2000s in terms of how commerce operated more broadly, or how marketing, so much has changed. So that plays out certainly differently depending upon your competitive situation, what sort of business you're in. So I think that, what you have to do, and part of the advice I give, it's the second mind leap, is about waking up, like really being keenly aware and open to more possibilities, and really digging deep to understand how technology is changing the landscape, how societal pressure, so much, if you just think about a news event, again, there used to be a pretty big lag time between anybody would even know something happened, much less time for all the conspiracy theories to develop, all these other kinds of things we have to deal with, or somebody gets canceled, who's your spokesperson, brand spokesperson, and like, there's so many things that happen as a matter of course today that weren't possible 10, 15, 20 years ago, because Facebook didn't exist, or TikTok didn't exist, or what have you. So I think it makes it's much more hard to discern what's going to be important, for sure. One of the things I mentioned in the book is, although I guess I hide it a little bit, but when I was at Neiman Marcus, we had projects to try to understand the impact on our business from MySpace and Second Life, 2 things which turned out to be basically nothing, right?
Right.
So, it's not always obvious, or, 2-3 years ago in retail anyway, everybody was talking about the metaverse, which has turned out to be pretty much a big nothing burger, right? So you don't always know what is going to turn out to be important, or how quickly it's going to turn out to be important. So there's a lot of information to digest. There are a lot of scenarios to spin through. But I think the main thing is you have to be open to that, to digesting that information, exploring, developing the capacity to discern, maybe do pilots, proof of concepts, or whatever, to try to figure out what this is about and what might be relevant to your organization. And that's just a much harder world. So I think from a leadership standpoint, it does take a lot of curiosity. It does take beginners' minds. It does me being vulnerable. Like, I don't understand this. One of the companies I work with, we were talking about the impact of large language models. And the CEO finally said, okay, I know I'm supposed to really understand what a large language model is. I don't. Can somebody please explain it to me? And I thought, good for you. Like, he wasn't afraid, because, part of him, I'm sure, said, like, I'm the CEO. I'm supposed to know what this is. But I think, he was sort of faking his way through it, until finally got to the point where he was like, okay, I'm at the point now where I'm probably going to do something stupid if I don't actually understand this a little bit better. But I think that takes, that's part of the courageous leadership part, is to ask for help when you need it, which is something, I finally did in what we were talking about earlier. Wish I had done it far earlier, probably like 2 decades earlier. So I was a little late on that. So I think there's a lot of it that, I ultimately think that this book is really kind of a courageous leadership book. It's just much more about, I try to place it in the context of how the pace of change is in most cases only accelerating. And so, while we had in many cases a fair amount of time to respond to e-commerce's impact and pervasive connectedness of smart devices, when you see how quickly generative AI has emerged on the scene in retail, companies like Temu and Shein, which didn't exist really 2 years ago, 3 years ago, which are now closing in on $50 billion in sales. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary, and it's enabled by technology that allows, the ability to marry customers and suppliers and do small batches. You have to understand the possibility of technology. I'm sure there will be brands that will leverage, entirely new business models that will leverage generative AI in a way that I can't. Maybe if I hold up with a bunch of experts for a month in the mountains, I could come up with. But I think most of us don't have. I certainly don't have the gift of prophecy or the ability to piece all that stuff together. So as a leader, you have to be willing to invite new and different voices into the conversation, seek insight almost everywhere. And that really wasn't so important a few years ago for most leaders, I don't think.
Well, I want to just very briefly mention, because you already talked about leadership mind leap number 2, which is wake up. I'm just going to run through these very briefly, but I'd like you to, for just a moment, to speak about one more as we are continuing the conversation. So here are the 7 for all of you that are watching and listening. Crush your ego, wake up, special, not big, start with wow, think radically, safe is risky, and the last one is faster, faster, go, go, go. I want to. I'd love to get your thoughts on faster, faster, go, go, go.
Sure.
Why? Well, first of all, in terms of the order of these, that was intentional, I would have to think, as you were strategically putting each of these. Okay. So faster, faster, go, go, go. Talk to us about that for a moment. Why is that so important? And give us an example of something. You pick any industry, pick any business, but let's just give an example of how faster, faster, go, go, go is put into action.
Well, there's a few reasons why that ended up being one of the mind leaps. One relates to the subtitle of the book, which is transforming at the speed of disrupt, or transforming your company at the speed of disruption, which does beg the question, what is the speed of disruption? And that will be different for every company, every industry. So while the pace of change is generally accelerating, and like we talked about with generative AI and other things, sometimes things come out of almost nowhere very, very quickly and completely upend things. So I think we all can see how change broadly is becoming more exponential than linear. So speed, understanding the speed of disruption for your particular situation, I would say is incredibly important. And generally, you'll want to move faster, if only because, well, partially because of what I just said, but also it's harder and harder to catch up if you fall behind. This is not to say, and one of the things I probably don't spend enough time on is, there's this expression, the second mouse gets the cheese. Apple's a great example of this. They're very rarely the leader, but they're a fast follower. So this doesn't mean you should always be first. In fact, one of the things I say towards the end of the book is I almost called the book Leaders Leap First. And I didn't like that ultimately because it's not about being first, but it is about leaping. And so I think in general, paying attention to your speed is hugely important. I think the other thing, and it actually gets a little bit to the chapter before that, safe is risky, is, it's one of the things, it's a little bit off your question, I'll make it quick, but one of the things I do when I'm doing a workshop or speaking to leadership teams and I'm new to working with them, is I'll often say, okay, just, tell me how things work around here. would you say the culture is wired to say yes, or is it wired to say no? And I can tell you, and of course, the people that invite me in are not necessarily a totally random sample of companies. So I will put that caveat. But everybody knows the right answer. The answer I'm looking for is wired to say yes. But almost always the actual truthful answer is wired to say no. So you see this little like looking around, kind of, and then I'm kind of like, okay, show of hands. How many of you, and then they're forced to declare. And every once in a while you see a bunch of people and they'll be like, oh, Bob, come on, we're not wired to say, there'll be this little interesting dynamic, but it helps me get a little bit of a sense. But most organizations that are big and successful or have been big and successful in the past are wired to say no. They have a department of no, as I talk about, or defenders of the status quo club, right? So there's a lot of that kind of behavior. So this idea, and I don't like using sports metaphors so much, but playing offense as opposed to playing defense. So I think from a speed standpoint, I sort of think about the athlete, and maybe because I've worked with Nike a bunch, but the athlete like sort of in the blocks, ready to spring. Like that orientation, I think for innovation is really important. It still matters when you decide to move. I'm not saying like just move to move, but that building agility, building the responsiveness into the way you do things, I think is particularly important. The last thing I think is particularly in this world, kind of what we were talking about a little bit earlier. In fact, I was working on something today where, and I'm trying to remember now who said it, but predictions are inherently difficult, especially when they involve the future, and it's very hard to predict. Like, yeah. But I think it is harder and harder all the time to predict the way things are going to play out, for all sorts of reasons. And so accepting that we live in a volatile, uncertain world and building agility into your system, I think is incredibly important. But building the muscle to, I don't know if they're fast twitch muscles or something, I'm overplaying the analogy, but the ability to act quickly and lean into taking chances, I think is incredibly important. So the culture of experimentation, I think organizations that are very good, I mean, Amazon's sort of famously good, Google, others are really good at trying a lot of stuff. One of the things I say in the book is, from my experience and others whose research I've drawn in on, is most companies that are really good at a lot of innovation haven't figured out a magic formula to innovate better than the other people. Not to say processes is important, skills aren't important. Like there's a lot of things that improve the conditions for success. But the companies that innovate more try more stuff. That is, if you want to isolate the variable, is they try more stuff and they kill things fast when they aren't working or rework them and pivot to make them more useful. But they don't hold on. I've worked with a couple of companies. We held on with, we have this pilot thing. I was, how long has this been a pilot? 3 years. That sounds like a really long time for a pilot. Well, so why haven't we killed it? Well, we can't kill it because it's we can kill it, but there's a process discipline there to, they kind of put all their eggs in one basket. That wasn't working. They had no other ideas. Maybe we'll just, weekend at Bernie's, drag the corpse of this project around for a while and something great will happen. I mean, those are just silly things. So I think there are a lot of practice, a long way of saying, I think there are a lot of practices that can be put into place, a lot of philosophies that can make your organization more built for speed. And again, depending upon your situation, you may need a lot more, like if you're dealing with generative AI across a spectrum of functions, my guess is you should probably have dozens and dozens of proof of concept or pilot things going on. If you're a dry cleaner, I don't know. You probably don't. Like speed is probably, new capabilities and just trying lots of stuff is probably not. I mean, now I'll probably get a nastogram from somebody in the dry cleaning business who will say, but there's clearly different paces of the speed of disruption that will affect how much time and energy you put into trying to accelerate. But the reason that I had it as the last one is, okay, if you've done all the things I suggest, or most of the things I suggest beforehand, and you've got this idea, you've got the awareness of all these issues, you've accepted, yes, I need to think more radically, I need to crush my ego, all this kind of stuff. The last part of that is action. And in my first book, I did this as well. It's, what better time than now? In a lot of cases, you don't need more time. You don't need more data. You need more courage. I mean, and so it's an excuse to not expose ourselves to ridicule or what have you, to keep studying and polishing. And I say this very much. I mean, I have leaned on a lot of people's others work in this area, probably most notably Stephen Pressfield's. But, my experience is if I hesitate, it's usually out of fear. It's not really because I need more data. I mean, and I can say that from a business perspective. I can say that I've been divorced 10 years now, and even asking somebody out, right? It's like I didn't ask them out because I'm afraid of rejection. It wasn't because I didn't want to, or that I needed more data about them. I mean, typically, I'm not saying never, but if we can just relate to the times where when we know what we want to do and we know what needs to be done, but we don't do it, that's usually out of fear. So I think as I got to the last chapter, I'm trying to say, okay, like we've been on this journey together. Here's all this advice. Now go do it, and cycle through things fast. And if it's not working, stop. If it's still got potential, rework it. But say yes, more. It's basically.
I love it. And it reminds me of what, kind of going back to Seth Godin for a moment, what he typically says, publish, right? Put the work out there.
Ship it.
Ship it. Does that mean that it's going to be perfect? No, there is no perfection, but take action.
Yeah.
I talk about this constantly. It's just like with Leaders Leap, any book that provides great information that we can actually apply, if we don't take action on it, yeah, we might have the knowledge, we may be a bit smarter, but to what end?
Yeah.
So actually take the information that you're learning and do something with it. Put it into action. So, my friends, we have been talking.
And if I could just
go, please go. No, go.
Well, I just
go,
have
go
maybe one other point, which actually is a little bit of a quick anecdote about Seth. So I think you do, just to be clear. Not only about my language about leaping, like not everything has to be a big leap. This is not about moonshots or Hail Marys or whatever. I mean, if you've gotten to that place, other things have gone wrong earlier, I would say. It's really about the mindset of acting more boldly and being willing to take chances. But to be clear, there are times, like I don't want Boeing just shipping a new plane out without checking it a lot. Like that's terrible advice for many situations. But the story about Seth, and as you point out, I've known Seth. Seth was best man at my wedding. I was best man. Like we've been friends, close friends for a really long time. But about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, when I was starting my consulting business, I thought, I'm going to write a blog, back when that was a thing, as a way to get my ideas out there. And Seth at that point had been blogging for, 6 or 7 years or something. And I asked for his advice, and I said, I'm going to do this thing. And, what is it going to be about? Anyway, I worked through all these things. And then some number of weeks go by, and he goes, hey, I haven't seen your blog yet. And I said, well, I'm not sure what platform to use, and, blah, blah, blah. And he said, okay, do you want my advice? I said, sure. He was going to give it to me anyway, whether I wanted it or not. But I said, sure. And he goes, okay, write something in the next hour and publish it. And I was like, well, I don't even know what I'm going to write about. He goes, write something in the next hour and publish it. That's your charge. And I said, yeah, but I was all this kind of stuff. And he said, well, here's the thing, which is a very Seth thing to say, by the way. I hope you're not listening, Seth, but I've said this to his face. He said, well, here's the great thing. Nobody knows who you are, and probably hardly anybody's going to read it. So if it's terrible, only 8 people will know. And I've gone back to look at that first post, and I've had some posts, not to brag, but that's a post that have, 100,000 reads or whatever, downloads, or views, I guess. That very first one, I don't even remember what it's about. but here 10, 11 years later, it's got like 80 views. Like it has almost no views. And of course, I don't know who those people are. There's probably my sister or somebody or Seth, you know. I mean, so there's an aspect of understanding what is really risky and trying to understand the cost of inaction. I think that's the thing. Like being reckless with shipping a plane out that's not ready to fly, that's a very different thing than saying, hey, you know, maybe in our store we should put a few extra people on the floor to see if our sales go up because maybe people are walking out the door because you know nobody's greeting them or whatever. I mean, no, you know, we can all come up with various kinds of things you could test, which is not a huge amount of money. But when you get into the habit of doing that, and like I said earlier, not lingering and holding on to stuff that's not working, but it's that trying more stuff, discipline for things that will advance your progress, not expose you to, you know, somebody getting killed or, I mean, those kinds of things are crazy to think about experimenting on, I would say. But
Absolutely.
so yeah, I think it's that, you know, say yes to more things, under balance, which is more the chapter before that, balance the risk of not doing it. I think we're really great at seeing the risk. You know, just like I'll go back to my example of asking somebody out. Well, there's the risk. Oh, she might say no. I might get rejected. That's not going to feel good. But you know what? Maybe she'll say yes, and it's going to be amazing, right? Like so. But it's in the moment when our fear comes up, it's a lot easier to not do it. But that's not really accounting for that pattern of stalling and not trying new stuff that leads many companies, like some we talked about earlier in the show, to a path of irrelevance or unfortunately in some cases complete extinction.
Absolutely. And remember, for all of you watching and listening right now, when nothing changes, nothing changes. So you've Steve, you've shared so much incredible value here today on the show. We have been talking about Leaders Leap, which we're going to provide a link to in the show notes with my special guest today, Steve Dennis. So Steve, as we are wrapping up our conversation today, I've got two quick things for you. One, I would love it if you would give all of us, including me, give all of us a challenge. What is one thing that you would challenge us to do starting today?
And it's not original advice, but it's kind of in the realm of do one thing today that scares you. But I think one way to think about that is take a list of things that have been like rattling around in your head or on your to-do list, score them on potential importance, and you know, kind of start from the top and do it, or get started at least. I mean, some things obviously can't be accomplished in just making a phone call or writing an email, but get started.
Very good. That's a great challenge. I know I'm going to take you up on that. I needed that little push, and thank you for that. And then here is my final question to you. What is one of the most difficult decisions that you've had to make in the pursuit of the person who you are today?
Well, this is going to be a little bit redundant, but I would say I struggle just about every day with some, I'll say, I don't know, disequilibrium in my ego, you know, where I feel the need to point out what somebody else is doing wrong, which I think is often just to make myself feel better. It's not a generous act. It is a critical act, and it's putting somebody down to make me feel better about myself. And I think it's a particular struggle for me because of my history and upbringing and all that kind of stuff. But I think for some of us, you know, not to project on you or anybody else listening, if you're in the ideas business, if you're in the I need to get a certain amount of attention, you know, it's like you have a podcast, you want people to discover it and recommend it and rate it highly, right? Like, so there's a lot of self-promotional things that I find myself doing. So I wrestle with well, if I don't promote myself, no one else would do it, but to do it in a way that can be seen as more of a gift rather than a, hey, look at me, look at how smart I am, or how funny I am, or whatever. I'll tell you really quickly, one thing I heard Brene Brown talk about when I saw her speak a few years ago, it was around how she approaches the audience when she speaks.
Okay.
And I've tried to employ this in some of my speaking, but I don't have nearly as many people listening to me as Brene. But someday. But she said, I try to think about these people are here not because they think I'm so great, but because I have a gift that I'm going to leave them with. And I think it's really a great, and I believe me, I don't do this very consistently, but to think about when we put our ideas out in the world and we interact with people, that it's a generous act, that there's a gift to it as opposed to it's transactional, or I need you to make me feel better about myself by going, oh my God, that was so smart, or whatever. So I think it's a really different orientation. And I think the more we get out of our ego, the more we are meeting people where they are, and the more we're giving rather than receiving. And it's nice to receive, believe me. I appreciate when people take the time to acknowledge something I've done. And obviously, I'd love people to buy the book and get something out of it. So I'm not saying that I don't have that desire or appreciate it. But yeah, I think about how you can go from going one up or one down on people, or needing affirmation, as opposed to the energy kind of, not a Marianne Williamson sort of energy thing. I don't mean it that way necessarily, but just think about, which direction is the gift headed, or are you just waiting for a gift of attention or affirmation or a like or whatever to come back to you?
Well, I want to say just a couple of things here very briefly. Number one, the fact, and we talked about this toward the beginning of the conversation, the fact that you have the self-awareness around this, I think, is step one. And that's a powerful step. That's a courageous step. So you recognize that ego, right? And because you recognize it, you can actually do something about it. Does it still show up? Sure, it shows up for all of us. It's how we choose to move through it, how we choose to move forward, the questions we're asking ourselves. Are we pausing before we respond? Things like that. And so you do have that self-awareness. And when it comes to gifts, you talked about Brene Brown and what she said. You've given us a gift today. Not only have you given us a gift of your insights, of your story, of your authenticity, of the challenges that you personally have faced, but you have also given us the gift of your written words as well. 2 books. You've got more in you. We know more's coming. And you just keep, just keep, all I would say to you is keep digging deep, because it's in there. It's in that well of knowledge. Just keep figuring out a way to bring that out to the world. And I just wanted you to know how much I appreciate you being here today and sharing with all of us on Business Minds Coffee Chat. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I'm grateful for you. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I really enjoyed it as well.
Absolutely. And for all of you, I want to thank you so very much for watching and for listening. And would you do me a quick favor? Would you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a matter of fact, while you're doing that, we're going to provide a link to Steve's podcast, which is incredible. Do exactly the same thing for him. Subscribe, rate, and leave him a review. Yes, that helps us all expand our reach and be able to attract amazing guests to our podcast. So would you please do that? That would be great. And to listen to more podcasts, all you need to do is visit jscherbusinessconsulting.com, click that podcast button. And until next time, you keep learning, keep growing, make sure that you run to pick up a copy of Leader's Leap. And as you heard today, take action and apply the lessons you learn. And we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care, everybody.